Okay. My name is Craig Breaden. I'm here with Art Rosenbaum. It's March 13th, 2007, and we're in the Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia in Athens. And we're doing this interview because, from my point of view, Art has put together a box set of some of the songs he's collected that will come out in the fall. And to me, this is, in talking to Art as we've been transferring the songs, he's had a lot of very interesting stories to tell. So I want to get some of these down on tape.
Okay.
So I'm just going to start off, and I've got a few questions on sort of how you got into it and how you got into collecting songs.
Sure.
And then I thought we might talk about some of the songs specifically. Or some of the people you recorded. So the first question I have is, how did you start collecting songs, and what were some of the early influences that helped guide you in collecting them?
Well, I started off being a player and singer of folk songs. I was interested in that from pretty early childhood. We had some records around the house of Pete Seeger and the Almanac Singers singing Union songs, and John Jacob Niles, and later on Burl Ives. Just kind of a cross section of what types of folk music most like urban middle class people were listening to. Mm-hmm. Another thing I listened to was my father, who knew some interesting songs he learned as a kid in Paterson, New Jersey. That he sang, humorous songs or slightly bawdy songs, and so I got a little sense that people could sing songs spontaneously in their own home. But I got interested in playing guitar. I took guitar lessons, and then when I was in high school, I started playing the banjo and learned from Pete Seeger's book, How to Play the Five-String Banjo, which was the only guide then to anyone who didn't grow up in a banjo culture. And of course, in his book, he had pictures of Rufus Crisp and Uncle Dave Macon and Aunt Samantha Bumgarner, and he had met these folks, and that had been part of how he learned music. And I was a great Pete Seeger fan, so that gave me the idea that that you could go to sources, human sources, and learn something about this type of music. About the same time, when I was in high school, I met a guy named Dick Loring who ran a little folk music workshop at the Jewish Community Center in Indianapolis, and he had known Woody Guthrie and the Carter family, and he pointed me to the Harry Smith Folkways anthology. And and also 2 Lomax sets, Smoky Mountain Ballads and Come Listen to Our Story, and all those were reissues of early commercial recordings of country music and blues. So even before the big pop folk boom, I was listening to this real interesting material that was put out for special audiences, like the so-called race records and hillbilly records, which were for the black and for the southern white audiences. And I was enthralled with the material, and it fit right in with my interest in learning to pick the banjo, and also I looked at some of the Lomax collection, some of the books. So I knew there was such a thing as going out and doing field work, recording music. And I also, I guess, somewhere along the line learned there was a distinction between the scholarly field work with the intention of documenting traditions, but not necessarily marketing them, and these commercial records, which, and the genres tended to overlap. So I was aware of that, but meanwhile I was mainly interested in learning how to play and sing. And then when I went to college at Columbia in 1956, met a lot of people who were good pickers in the urban scene, who were doing finger picking and clawhammer banjo, and were enthusiasts. And about the same time, I heard a Pete Seeger concert, and he said, "Don't listen to me, listen to the people I learned from." So I think probably the first actual field recordings I did, and they're on this set, they were of some Mexican migrant farm workers. The one of them whose name I did write down was Epifanio Sanchez, and one of the summers that I was in college, I was working at a resort hotel in southwestern Michigan, on Lake Michigan, and I drifted over to these little general stores and camps where migrant farm workers were working, and went to one of the stores, and there were some Mexican migrant farm workers playing acoustic guitars and singing corridos. And one of them was Carabina 3030, 3030 carbine that was used by Pancho Villa in the Revolution. It's a pretty famous old corrido, and I don't remember where I got a tape recorder from, but I had a little reel-to-reel tape recorder, and I recorded that and several other songs. And the Carabina 3030 will be on this set that you referred to. And then I think it was the following summer, I drifted into some of the other camps and little general stores in Michigan, in that area of Michigan. Just in the evening after I'd finished my work, and met some other folks. They were poor white folk from Tennessee, North Carolina, Missouri, who were following the crops, and their pattern of life was not much different from what you'd read in Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. They were driving these old cars and following the crops and living in these little villages of little shanties. And one particular family lived in a tent where they had no electricity. But I would bring a tape recorder around and record some of their songs, which ranged all the way from fairly recent country and western songs off the radio to early blues, to fiddle dance tunes, to ballads like Barbara Allen and Blackjack Davy, and that gave me a sense of music in its context. Some of these guys had been semi-professional musicians. They played on radio stations, small radio stations in southern Missouri, but they played a pretty much of a down-home style. Mm-hmm. And those were about the first field recordings I made. Then I went, maybe I'm getting things a little out of sequence. I heard Pete Seeger's concert after a couple years had gone by, and he had visited Pete Steele a short time before that. And Pete Steele, who lived in Hamilton, Ohio, and he was a banjo picker and singer from Knox County, Kentucky, and I'd also started listening to records that the Library of Congress had issued. That's another thing Alan Lomax and the Lomaxes should get credit for. As far as I know, they're the first people to issue for purchase field recordings. And they did this through the Library of Congress Archive of American Folk Songs. So these were not like the old commercial 78s, but they were sea shanties, ballads, work songs from southern prisons. And there were several sets of them. They're still available through the Library of Congress, and it's been added to over the years. Native American, Indian music, and I know the Lomaxes believed that the performance was very important. Previous collectors had either not used recording equipment at all, and like Cecil Sharp had written down music notation and with his assistants or himself written down the texts, or if they'd used recording equipment, they used it just for transcriptions and for archives, but the Lomaxes felt something like Pete Steele playing The Last Payday at Coal Creek and singing, or the songs from from Sugarland Prison and in Texas, or Parchman Penitentiary in Mississippi, the singing of black convicts, the expressive art that was in those performances needs to be heard directly. So, I went to the library at Columbia University, where I was a student, and checked out the records and put on the headphones and listened to those wonderful sounds. And then then Pete Seeger had found that Pete Steele was still active and playing in Hamilton, Ohio, and Alan and Elizabeth Lomax had recorded Pete Steele for the Library of Congress in 1938. So this was quite a few years after that. This was in '57 or so. And my friend Ed Cann, who later became quite a noted folklorist, who sadly died a couple of years ago, he was a high school classmate, and he shared my interest. So we went over to meet Pete Steele and his wife Lily Steele, and I went over there twice, and Ed went over another time, and got to hear a lot of great banjo picking and singing, and a lot of different kinds of songs, courting songs, old ballads, breakdowns, bad man ballads. So I was into it, and couldn't have asked for better hosts than Pete and Lily Steele. They were just delighted that we came by, and loved sharing their music with us. And Pete Steele actually taught me how to play a couple of tunes. And my friend George Gibson, who's from Knott County, Kentucky, who's about my age, who grew up in a banjo picking culture, where old-time banjo playing and singing was practiced and prevalent, he says that you learned by, the way he puts it, by emulation, not imitation. He says his father never explained how you plow a mule. He just went along plowing with his father, and then his father gave him the reins and said, "Now you do it, because you pick it up because you're around it." And he says it was the same thing with music. And so he says nowadays people learning old-timey music like banjo and fiddle, they've got books of tablatures, and they go to workshops, and they're taught how to play certain tunes note for note, even though they're just the way Tommy Jarrell played something, and then of course they're told to improvise or add their own licks, but basically it's by imitation. But I've heard many times stories that would confirm what George Gibson says. That it's emulation. Like George Childers was an old-time banjo player from Pickens County here in Georgia, and he'd say, "I don't know why it is, but my dad never showed me one thing in the world." His dad would play for him, but he wouldn't. He would never show him how to do the picking. But Pete Steele, I guess, knowing that I was a city boy from Indianapolis and enthusiastic, and I said, "How do you play Coal Creek March?" And so he conceded to show me how to play by imitation, because he just bent over my shoulder, and he told me to put my hands there, and then he had his first finger and thumb, and he showed me some particular rolls that you do note for note, and you can't get anything better than that. But he was willing to make that concession to my request. That was a pretty long preamble. So stop me if I get off topic or too long on something.
That was fantastic. I think I might be revisiting some of those topics in these other questions, but we'll see. And we can go over it even again, because the stories are fascinating. Just sort of thinking, as time moves forward, and you've started to collect songs, and you've had some influences who've, like Seeger and the Lomaxes and the Harry Smith collection, and you had some experience in the form of collecting folk song and traditional song, before the real boom in the early and mid 60s. And you'd sort of been in that scene before that boom, and in fact contributed to that boom. How did collecting folk songs change after that resurgence, or that the folk boom of the early and mid 1960s? Did it change for you? And how?
Well, there are a couple things I could say in response to that, Craig. Like, at first, I made these recordings so that I could take them back home and listen to them and learn how to play. And plus, I realized that they were, a document of a time and a place. I wasn't thinking of putting them in archives, or I wasn't thinking of myself in the same category as these monumental figures like the Lomaxes. But I realized that some of this material did have value. So a couple things happened during my college years, and right after that, I got to know some folks like, I guess I met Mike Seeger at the Philadelphia Folk Festival after he put out his first recording that he'd documented, which was American Banjo Scruggs style, where he recorded not Earl Scruggs, but Earl Scruggs' brother, and a great banjo player originally from North Carolina, but lived in South Carolina, Snuffy Jenkins, and people who had played the pre-Scruggs or early Scruggs three-finger style. So he was starting to do that, and a couple of years later, he was recording Elizabeth Cotton, who he knew through his family. And I met John Cohn then, and John Cohn was a fellow artist. I was an art student, and he'd gone to Yale Art School. But he was very interested in old-time banjo and guitar, and of course he and Mike Seeger and Tom Paley formed the New Lost City Ramblers around that time. They were the first urban band to seriously study and try to perform string band music of the kind that was heard in the early 78s. But John was interested in going to the source, and in the mid-50s he made a really important trip to Kentucky, to East Kentucky, where he met Banjo Bill Cornett and especially Roscoe Holcomb, who was a great voice and banjo player. And so some of my friends were out doing field work. John had a connection with Folkways, and so did Mike. And so it became a possibility to issue some of this material that we were collecting out of interest. Of course, John did. His first one was Mountain Music of Kentucky with Roscoe Holcomb and several other people on it. I had a friend from my hometown, Indianapolis, Pat Dunford, and Pat was a few years younger than I was. He came up to my door. He lived in my neighborhood, and he said, "Hey, you're interested in collecting for folk music?" So he said, "I love old time music," and he thought he was a distant relative of Uncle Eck Dunford of Virginia, who had been in the old Bog Trotters band with the Ward family, and he was very interested in going down and meeting firsthand tradition bearers. And we went on a couple trips to Kentucky together and southern Indiana, and we looked up some of the informants that had contributed songs to Paul Brewster's Indiana collection, which came out I think around 1940, and some of them like Doc Parks. No, I guess he wasn't in Brewster's collection, but when Lomax went a few years after that, looking up some of Brewster's informants, he found this Kentuckian, a good ballad singer, Doc Parks, and and Pat Dunford and I looked him up and found him. But we also found Mrs. Underhill, who had contributed some songs to Brewster's collection, and Alan Lomax had tried to visit her because she had some interesting songs, but apparently the creek was too high or the roads were too muddy and couldn't get back to her. But we met her and spent an interesting day recording her and her brother Virgil Sandage. And about the same time, John Cohen had played a little cassette tape that some friends in Los Angeles had sent him. He said, these are two fiddlers from Indiana, Dan White and John W. Summers. Dan White was a probate court judge from Indianapolis, and he was vacationing on a dude ranch, and he, I guess, had a fiddle and said he was a fiddler, and so these friends of John Cohen were interested in that. And Dan White said, my friend Dick Summers, John W. Summers' nickname was Dick. Dick Summers, he's a much better fiddler than I am. And so he made this little cassette and sent it to these people, and they sent it to John, and John said, you ought to listen to this. And this was amazing fiddling. Particularly, I was particularly thrilled with Summers playing Rye Straw and Brickyard Joe. But so I said, well, next time I go back home to Indianapolis, I'll look him up. So went over and looked him up. Judge White lived in an old house in a kind of Victorian neighborhood of Indianapolis, and Dick Summers drove down from his farm up near Wabash, Indiana, and I heard some of the most wonderful fiddle playing I'd ever imagined, not only heard but imagined hearing. Only in the key of G that time, because Summers would play one tune in G, and that reminded him of another tune. So finally, got a little tired and said, well, come up to my farm. So I went up several times, and I recorded a good bit of his repertoire, but he had a huge repertoire. So the first project I did for Folkways was this LP called Fine Times at Our House, and it was Indiana folk songs, ballads, and fiddle tunes, all from white folks. Summers was on it, and Mrs. Underhill and her brother, and Vern Smelser is a traditional singer from Paoli, Indiana, and these were folks that Pat Dunford and I had either recorded together or separately on different trips, and I think it worked out to be a significant collection of recordings of older Indiana folk songs. Mrs. Underhill sang the Indiana Hero, which was one that referred specifically to Indiana. It's an old ballad called Fuller and Warren that goes back to the early 19th century. So that provided like an outlet. Another thing that happened was this African-American lady who did housework for my family told me about a guitar player that she knew, because I guess I expressed interest in music. So in older music, she said I know a guitar player who plays blues and Christian songs, and he makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck. And so I said, well, where do I find him? So she told me where he lived, and that was Scrapper Blackwell. And I was underage to buy alcohol, and some of Scrapper's friends said, you got to get bird seed in order to get the bird to sing. So I said, what are you talking about? They said, beer. And so I said, I can't, I'm underage. So they said, give us some money, we'll get it. So they got some beer, and Scrapper played not only blues, but early pre-blues things. And I didn't, and he talked about that he had a recording career back in the 20s and 30s. And I had never heard any of his records at that time. I didn't know his name. I knew a lot of them, like Blind Lemon Jefferson and Lead Belly and Mississippi John Hurt, and people who were on some of the other old records. But remember the following Sunday at the Unitarian Church, I was talking to a friend of mine, Ted Watts, who collected old 78s. I said, I met this great guitar player, and I even made some tapes of him last week. His name is Scrapper Blackwell. And Ted Watts almost went through the ceiling. He said, Scrapper Blackwell's here in Indianapolis. I said, yeah, and he's playing and all. So Ted sort of filled me in on, Scrapper's career, playing with and recording with Leroy Carr, the piano player, and also with other people, and also quite a few solo guitar and vocal 78s up to 35 when Leroy died, and then I think Scrapper made a few recordings after that, but then he went pretty much into obscurity and worked at the city asphalt plant and played, but mainly at house parties and just around town. Even though he was an amazing musician, styles changed, and by the 40s, I guess, when the blues bands started coming up and electric music started coming in, his style of blues was no longer sought after. And through him, I met several other people. Brooks Berry, who was a woman who played a little bit of guitar and sang blues very well, and worked a lot with Scrapper. And then guitar Pete Franklin, was sort of a younger exponent of the Indianapolis guitar style. Pete has told people that Scrapper did not invent the style, that other people in Indianapolis played that style, including a guy named Jesse Ellery, who I got to meet once but never recorded. And then some people from the Deep South who'd moved up to Indianapolis to work in the factories. Most notably was Shirley Griffith, who had been a protege of Tommy Johnson and around Jackson, Mississippi. And Tommy Johnson was one of the greatest of the early Mississippi blues players, and I guess he did most of his recording in 1928, and that was the same year Shirley Griffith moved up to Indianapolis. But Shirley could play almost all of Tommy Johnson's numbers and a lot of others. And J.T. Adams, who was from Kentucky, and eventually I met Yank Rachel, James Rachel, who was not only a guitar player but a mandolin player, and he had recorded some of the early 78s with different other artists, including Sleepy John Estes. So, and then would go from place to place and meet other blues musicians, whoever Guitar Pete took a notion to visit on a particular afternoon. But anyway, 1961, which was the summer after I got out of graduate school at Columbia in painting, I was talking to Kenny Goldstein, and Kenny Goldstein, who later became a professor of folklore, an academic folklorist, but was also very involved with putting out LP issues of all kinds of folk music, traditional folk music from British Isles and America, and also some of the newer or more urban interpreters. But he was sort of the chief producer for Prestige International and Prestige Bluesville. Prestige, I guess, originally started as a jazz label, but they pretty much gave him carte blanche to bring out any LPs, folk of any kind that he thought were interesting. So when I told him that I was in touch with Scrapper Blackwell and I was going back home in the summer of '61, he said, well, do 5 LPs, do one of Scrapper with someone else, and 3 more. So I went around mostly with my own portable equipment, but went into a few times went into a little very small studio and recorded the material for one Scrapper Blackwell LP, which they say you can buy for big bucks on eBay now, if you can. It's strange how things are. And one of Scrapper and Brooks, one of Shirley Griffith by himself, one of Shirley Griffith and J.T. Adams, and one of guitar Pete Franklin, and they all came out in the following year. And Scrapper was disappointed that he wasn't making a lot of money off of these, because he had been making lots of money even during the Depression with his early 78s. Before a recording session, the A&R man would give him a roll of $50 bills, the day before, go out on the town and just show up at the studio the next day, and he couldn't understand why he was getting just a few $100s for an LP with so many songs on, or a couple $100. Mm-hmm. I remember I got $60 total, which was my fee for writing the liner notes. The rest was just a labor of love. But times had changed. A lot of folks did understand that, and like even right now, I'm trying to explain to Mary Lomax, the ballad singer that I guess we'll talk about a little later. I said, well, we're going to put out some of your music on some CDs, but I should tell you that I'm doing it because I love doing it, and you love to sing these songs, and maybe there'll be a little money that comes back, sure, but it's not going to be like what kind of music is big selling music these days. And so she says, you're saying we're not going to get rich. So I said yes. But so some people understand. But anyway, the way that kind of dovetails with what you were asking a while ago about the folk revival is that the folk revival of the 50s and 60s that included everyone from, well, I guess it started with the Weavers, and then it went to the Kingston Trio and Peter, Paul, and Mary, and then Bob Dylan and Joan Baez. All these folks could be heard like at the Newport Folk Festival, the Philadelphia Folk Festival, and there was an overlap because at the same time, people like Mississippi John Hurt were getting quote unquote rediscovered, and new voices for the outside world like Roscoe Holcomb were emerging. So they got invited to the Newport Festival, and so so at the same festival you'd hear what I guess they call revival acts, and you'd hear the traditional musicians, and there was kind of a mutual interest or influence. In my particular case, as I was saying a minute ago, since I got started listening to the grassroots stuff before the pop groups came on the scene, with maybe the exception of the Weavers I listened to a little bit. I never was that interested in the more popularizing folks. Although I did sometimes I'd play with them or be a sideman on some different recording sessions. But I was always more interested in the old school tradition bearers.
Was there ever an expectation on behalf of the people who you recorded? Everything we've talked about, you've told me basically people were very, very helpful and loved to play. But was there ever sort of the expectation after